Greetings, this is Griff Ruby, the Nostalgia Catholic, with my first review, and this one is of a book, Isaac Asimov's Foundation. As you can see, this particular volume of it is an omnibus volume that has the original Foundation in it, and also the Foundation and Empire, and then also finally the second Foundation. So, and by the way, you can see from the wear and tear on this book, I bought it brand new. So that's kind of a measure of how much I enjoyed it and how many times I've read it. I try to take good care of my books, but this has just been read so many times. I'd show you a Gnome Press edition if I had one, but I don't. But I do have an Ace book, which is kind of a neat thing to see. So that's Ace. Now, what happens in there? Well, Isaac Asimov came into Mr. Campbell's office, who was the editor at Astounding Science Fiction, who he become particularly close and was working as an author. And Campbell had actually said, well, I was just reading Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and maybe you could do a science fiction rendition. And he said, yeah, that's a great idea. And they got talking stuff back and forth. They came up with this whole really neat idea called psychohistory. So he goes home and he writes something, a story simply called Foundation, and it gets published in the May 1942 edition of Astounding. Didn't make the cover, unfortunately, but it's a pretty neat story all the same. And in this very early story, it picks up, strangely enough, not at the beginning of where we would have the book. I'll get back to that in a little bit, but actually with the second. The book Foundation actually has 5 basic parts to it, and the second of those 5, they're chronological in the context of the story, but they're not the way they first came out. The second was part of those 5, was the first to come out. It now goes into the title The Encyclopedists, but originally it was simply called Foundation. And it says here, it is a characteristic of a decadent civilization that their scientists consider all knowledge already known, that they spend their time making encyclopedic gatherings of that knowledge. But that foundation is something rather tricky. And it starts off with a rather interesting group of paragraphs that did not get into the final book. It portrays a very different glimpse of Hari Seldon, in fact, in many ways. So I'm going to read just some of it here. We have done, and our work is over. The galactic empire is falling, but its culture shall not die, and provision has been made for a new and greater culture to develop therefrom. The 2 scientific refuges we planned have been established, one at each end of the galaxy, at Terminus and at Star's End. They are in operation and already moving along the inevitable lines we have drawn for them. For us is left only one last item, and that 50 years in the future. That item, already worked out in detail, will be the instigation of revolts in the key sectors of Anacreon and Loris. Anacreon we'll hear a lot about. Loris is never mentioned again, and in fact, when these paragraphs went away, the word doesn't even show up in the book Foundation as originally published. I think, this is my guess, that these 2 scientific refuges at opposite ends of the galaxy were more or less similar as originally planned. And that, Anacreon was near Foundation number 1, and Loris is somewhere near Foundation number 2. So, kind of an interesting thought here. It will set that final machinery in motion to work itself out in the millennium that follows. I think that's all I need to read. So, the next thing is we're on this planet 50 years down the pike from that time, wherein there's you have the Encyclopedia Foundation number 1 that's located at this particular end of the galaxy. By end, we really mean just somewhere physically so far from the center of the galaxy where the Empire is controlled from a world called Trantor. To get some passing mention at first, and later we'll see more of it. So it's this planet on a lonely little star, almost as far as possible, and it's called Terminus. So what's happening here is that you have Encyclopedia Foundation number 1 is run by a guy named Louis Pyrene, and but it's on this planet called Terminus, where all the not only encyclopedia people but all their families and everything all shipped out to this lonely little planet in the middle of nowhere. this is when the Galactic Empire still encompassed the whole galaxy, and they could set this thing up way out there, and they could say, this is ours, everybody leave it alone, this is ours. Now we're 50 years down the pike. The Galactic Empire is losing its power. Several local groups of star systems in that area, and probably all around the fringes of the galaxy, are already breaking off from that empire. And you got 4 of them right immediately adjacent. Anacreon is the most important of them. Another one is called Smyrna. There's a couple others that, they're there, and we call them the 4 kingdoms, but they don't really are scarcely matters. And Anacreon, realizing that, hey, the Empire has no influence out here anymore, decides they'd like to annex or colonize this Terminus world, because they can already see that the people on Terminus, by building this encyclopedia that they've been working on for 50 years, they know a lot of this stuff. They know all this technology and how things work, and have kept science, somewhat alive, at least preserved, which is more than Anacreon or Smyrna or the others were, anybody was doing. And even the Galactic Empire was starting to lose what it knew. So that was really something, it was a real prize. But how do they stop it? Well, first they want to talk to the Empire, and they get some guy to come all the way from the Empire, and he makes it sound like, yeah, you're still protected, you're under our protection, but you go through the fine print of everything he does and says, no, he didn't promise anything at all, he was just doing a show. So the Anacreonians have figured that out, and now they're ready to just kind of move in and take over. This is the only Foundation installment, by the way, that ends on a cliffhanger. What do they do to drive them away? That doesn't get solved until the next installment, which luckily, conveniently, comes out the very next month, in June of 1942. This time it does get the cover. And so in June, you have another story, and this story was called Bridal and Saddle. And so this is now talking about more about Salvor Hardin. It's 30 years beyond that 50 years, and a lot has happened. Louis Pyrene gone. But Salvor Hardin has continued on as the mayor, and over those 30 years, he has allowed the surrounding kingdoms the use of the technology, and they're afraid that maybe they're going to, and people are afraid that the surrounding kingdoms might use that technology to just move in and take over and conquer this Foundation world, the Terminus world. But that's not going to happen because the technology was provided, but we didn't show them how it's made or how it works. We only trained certain people in a kind of special priesthood of how to operate it, and that's all. And it's surrounded with all this priesthood-like mummery of some kind of a religion or whatever that they surrounded their technology with, so that basically they could still control all these surrounding kingdoms. The kingdoms wanting the technology, benefiting by it, except this religion because it obviously works. The magic generator really makes all the houses light up. Ooh, that's great. So they take all this. But, that's for the masses. You still got the people there who run things. And you got this guy named Winus, who's kind of a regent for this new boy king that he's actually trying to bump off, named Leopold. And he's got this whole plot of his own that he's going to try to take and conquer the Terminus, the Foundation world, because, and it hastily mentioned what they did to drive everybody away back 30 years previous. You blink and you miss it, but it does have it there. I won't give it because I'm not doing any spoilers here. But at any rate, he wants to come in and take over. So he's actually going to use all this technology that he's got and do exactly what the Foundationers were afraid of. That he's going to take this technology. I mean, they're supplying them with battleships, for crying out loud. They're going to take these battleships and fight the Foundation. And what does the Foundation do about that? Well, again, I'm not giving you any spoilers, but let's just say it's Salvor Hardin's idea. And Winus is driven back in total humiliation. I think he ends up killing himself. So I guess now that means Leopold will be able to grow up and become king and all. So that's the second part. And it appears in the book under the title called The Mayors. The next installment appears in August of 1944. Now Astounding has become a small digest magazine. And it appears as a story called The Big and the Little. And it's a story about a trader named Hober Mallow, who is helping this foundation to establish trade. Because even though this religious mummery was enough for the four kingdoms, the surrounding kingdoms beyond those saw all that and says, we don't want any of this religious mummery. We'll be happy to have your devices and just live with you and trade with you if you like, but we don't want any of this mummery. We're going to take these devices and we want to understand this stuff. And you can keep your four kingdoms and they can be your defenders so you're safe. So trade becomes an important thing. So, but as they're trying to do that, we're kind of beginning to see some of the disintegration. At one point, Hober Mallow was visiting this planet where, it had been not that called Siwena, where not that long before it had been under Empire control. And he goes there and he finds, yeah, they still have a nuclear reactor there. It's this great big complicated thing, and nobody there has the slightest idea how to fix it. And it kind of shows how, even though the Empire might still have some advanced technology, they've already forgotten how to fix it or build it or anything like that. All they can do is just hope it doesn't break, or maybe if there's like for like that you could replace, you might be able to do that if there's a spare on hand. That's about it. So it's really hard for the Empire, even though it's still humongous. And if they really wanted to wipe out, the Foundation, they certainly would have the muscle to do it. But they were already retreating from this other world somewhat. So then he finally, in trying to establish trade with some place, does something that the traders were not supposed to do, because you could do trade inside the four kingdoms, but you always had to work with the priesthood of those who knew how to work the technology. But Hober Mallow basically allows one of these priests, so-called, to be captured by the Corellian secret police. And this is a big no-no. And how does he get out of that? Well, he can protect himself well enough. He's a very smart man. Again, I won't get into that. That's a spoiler, so I won't get into that. But along all of this thing, and then there's one more small installment, a rather unimportant one, comes out in October of 1944. Does not get the cover this time, and it's called the Wedge. And it is here you can see another piece of art from the Wedge here. In the Wedge, it's another story of another trader. Again, there's another world that doesn't want to deal with Foundation's religion. It seems to have its own religion and mysticism anyway. And they don't like technology, but they could be sold the gold that can be used, because apparently some of this technology can transmute other things into gold. So it's not a terribly interesting story. It's mostly just a short story set in a generally Foundation time context. Interestingly enough, these two installments were reversed in order when they got collected into the book. So this last one gets called The Traders, and it's just kind of a little snapshot of how the trade is beginning to succeed religion as this way to spread it. And then the last one, the big final part of the book, has Hober Mallow, doing more trade and even turning a priest aside and letting him be captured by the Corellian secret police and so forth. So we're seeing this outworking, but the people can protect themselves, but this overall growth, the use of religion first, the capture of knowledge in the beginning with his encyclopedia, then the use of religion to do the four kingdoms, and then this trade we see in both these other two sections is another way of kind of building an empire, are all part of the outworking of what's called the Selden Plan. And this is this plan using a weird science called psychohistory that says, well, when you get to a number of human beings, and only human beings apparently seem to exist, at least in a consequential amount, as rational beings. You don't have a galaxy full of all these different alien beings. There might be some few here and there in the galaxy, but the other intelligent species are just of no particular significance for the most part. Humans it's pretty much an almost exclusively human being galaxy, and along with what human beings find. They may find some lower life here and there, I don't know, but mostly human beings and what they bring with them, colonizing all these planets throughout the whole galaxy and establishing this empire. So you've got now this whole big empire, and it was growing, this whole big plan, using a mathematical science called psychohistory. Psychohistory was the idea that when you get all these quintillions of human beings that would fill a whole galaxy, it's like after a while they become like little atoms, like atoms of gas in a container. Um, you'll follow certain very simple laws. PV equals nRT for those who know a little rudimentary chemistry, or Bernoulli's principle, and so forth. And large numbers of human beings kind of have similar sort of laws that can apply to how things will happen and develop, and all these huge trends that are just, historically they're so huge that we're just like little particles of dust caught in this wave that's going this way and that way, and we can maneuver ourselves around a little. What makes no difference to these whole great big waves of where everything's moving historically. So in psychohistory, they have that all mathematized out in some way so they can be very specific. And so the preservation of the foundation, despite the cleverness of some of the people involved, especially Salvor Hardin, who apparently did have a little rudimentary instruction in psychohistory so that he would know what to do, enough to know what to do. But after that, it's purely just blind forces. Hober Mallow can protect himself from being persecuted for turning over that priest, but what goes on with the expansion of trade is kind of inevitable and really has almost nothing to do with him. It was the next step, psychohistorically. But now, that's how much came out before 1950. When the Foundation book finally came out, Isaac Asimov wrote the first part, which he called simply The Psychohistorians. Now, the Psychohistorians expand out that itty-bitty little few paragraphs that were the first installment with a whole much larger scenario. You have this guy named Gal Gornick who comes to Trantor. He is the last of the mathematicians to be joining Harvey Seldon and his group of so many mathematicians and other people that are going to be involved in this whole Foundation project. And so he's kind of exploring Terminus a little bit, and he's meeting up with Harvey Seldon. And then Harvey Seldon gets captured, put on trial. How does all that develop? And that's pretty neat. It establishes a lot of things, and it's kind of important here. By this time now, we have, the Second Foundation is spoken of a little bit different here. Let's see here. I don't understand. You will. Seldon's lined face grew peaceful, tired, both at once. Most will leave for Terminus, but some will stay. It will be easy to arrange. But as for me, he concluded with a whisper so Gal could scarcely hear him, I am finished. So it's kind of like the end of Harvey Seldon. We still don't know a lot about him. He's just kind of this grand old man, who had this genius thing that he did. But we don't really know how that happened yet. And so that launches this whole thing. It's kind of neat to get more of a glimpse of the kind of person that he is. He really loves civilization. He really wants to help the galaxy. There's nothing he can do to stop the galactic empire from just collapsing utterly, but he can form this foundation that's a nucleus of a new second empire that would manage to rise within 1,000 years, as opposed to some 30,000 years or something longer that it would take just to hopefully maybe become an empire again someday eventually. So that's kind of the goal, and he's able to justify that. And so that's how you start it. And then you have all these different visitations, because he's dead in that period. He was already this old man. So when we get to the next part, where we see the mayors and the encyclopedists, and then the mayors, and then the traders, and then finally the merchant princes, those different parts of what they call them. Harvey Seldon is almost little more than a name. They talk about the Seldon plan, and they don't really think much about the man anymore. There's the plan, which is all this whole way that psychohistorically he's worked it out that everything will turn into this grand new empire within 1,000 years, second empire. And I think that pretty much covers the first Foundation book.